the year 2030, only 17% of SDGs are on track. We also note that several developing countries remain fiscally constrained in directing sufficient resources towards SDGs on account of increasing debt burdens, highlighting the need to strengthen mechanisms for resolving debt crises. Against this backdrop, Zambia was privileged to have co-facilitated the outcome document of the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, which unanimously adopted the Sevilla Commitment. This outcome has renewed global consensus to close the $4 trillion annual SDG financing gap. It is now time to move from commitments to action. We call on all nations, development banks, and the private sector to align their policies and investments with the SDGs. Official development assistance, a lifeline for less developed countries, must be protected. There is need to scale up domestic resource mobilization, embracing innovative financing mechanisms, tackling illicit financial flows, and promoting private sector involvement. Madam President, for too long, the current international financial architecture has perpetuated structural inequalities, particularly for developing countries. The post-war institutions designed to promote global economic stability and growth no longer reflect today's geopolitical and economic realities. Many African countries continue to bear the weight of unsustainable debt, limited access to concessional financing, and the effects of global shocks beyond their control, from climate change to pandemics and global conflicts. We therefore welcome the commitments from various stakeholders for comprehensive reform of the global financial system. This reform should include governance reform of global financial institutions to strengthen representation of developing countries in international economic decision-making. Zambia further welcomes initiatives such as the Borrowers Forum to ensure fair and timely resolution of debt. Madam President, Zambia is both a least developed country, LDC, and a landlocked, or as we prefer, land-linked developing country, an LLDC. These two categories of countries face unique structural challenges. In July 2025, Zambia was privileged to host the LDC Future Forum in Lusaka, whose insights on building resilience to shocks and the need for innovation to address challenges were empowering. During the conference, our Republican President, Mr. Hakainde Hichilema, underscored the need for LDCs to build resilience by being more proactive and self-reliant. As a landlocked country, Zambia welcomes the AWAZA program of action, which prioritizes structural transformation, trade facilitation, regional connectivity, resilience, and ICT infrastructure, which reflect our own priorities. We also welcome the AWAZA's call for innovative financing. Landlocked need not mean isolated and encased. I repeat, Madam President, landlocked need not mean isolated and encased. As our President fondly states, LLDCs can become land-linked rather than landlocked, and we in Zambia are committed to making this vision a reality. Allow me to appeal, Madam President, that even as we reform the office of the High Representative for landlocked, for less developed countries, landlocked countries, and SIDS must be maintained. It is of imperative importance. Madam President, the theme of this session, Better Together, also compels us to reflect on the United Nations' readiness to address today's complex challenges. The Security Council's current composition and working methods reflect a bygone era and are overdue for reform. Decisions on critical peace and security issues are all too often stalled by the veto power of a few, even when the wider membership speaks clearly. Africa, with 1.4 billion people, still has no permanent seat a historical injustice that must be rectified. Zambia therefore reaffirms the Common Africa position on Security Council reform as set out in the El Zulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration. We call for comprehensive reform that expands both permanent and non-permanent membership to make the Council more equitable, effective, and reflective of today's world. Madam President, Excellencies, 80 years ago, the world emerged from war with a promise to never again allow division and destruction to define our collective future. That promise is being tested today. Let this 80th General Assembly be remembered as a turning point where the world chose solidarity over silence, justice over inertia, and unity over division. We must act not out of fear, but out of hope, not in isolation, but in solidarity, as we are better together. Madam President, Your Excellencies, I thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Zambia. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Anita Anund, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Canada.
President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, let me, Madam President, congratulate you on your election as President. Since the end of the Second World War, multilateral institutions have helped to make our world safer and more prosperous. More than 1 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. Famine and disease have declined. We see shared effort leading to shared prosperity. Pourtant, aujourd'hui,
however, today, this multilateral system is under threat. Some countries are turning more inward, looking at protectionism and unilateralism rather than multilateralism. Around the world, the geopolitical landscape is unstable. Those power is heading towards a way that is undermining, jeopardizing our security and prosperity. We are facing challenges that no country can address alone. Allow me to start with Canada itself, because the strength that we have abroad is based on resilience at home.
Proudly bilingual, resilient, dynamic democracy spanning 3 oceans, blessed with natural resources, and above all, defined by the ingenuity of our people. Our scientists are leaders in artificial intelligence and clean technology. Our workers are partnering in the global energy transition. Our entrepreneurs are advancing critical minerals, agriculture, and digital innovation. Canada is home to Indigenous peoples and to immigrants from every corner of the globe. Let me say a few words about Indigenous peoples on the eve of Canada's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. The voices of Indigenous peoples enrich our democracy at home and diplomacy abroad. Their leadership
has laid the foundations for the path followed by Canada and is strengthening our place in the world. Canada has for a long time been advocating for cooperation, diplomacy and international law. Whether this be a question of promoting peacekeeping operations of the UN, during the Suez crisis, or indeed the Ottawa Treaty that prohibits anti-personnel mines, Canada has always been an innovative leader on global issues. This is something that still guides us.
Not shrink from global challenge. Canada does not retreat from duty. Canada does not walk away from building and strengthening peace. Even as the world changes, Canada remains a stable and reliable partner, both in business and collective security. At its core, our foreign policy rests on 3 pillars. First, defense and security, keeping Canadians safe, strengthening our sovereignty, being good allies and partners in NATO and NORAD. Second, economic resilience, diversifying trade, strengthening supply chains, being an attractive destination for capital, and an entrusted trading partner while advancing rules-based trade. And third, core values, promoting democracy and pluralism, balancing and maintaining human rights, fostering gender equality, protecting our environment, and working with Indigenous partners on sustainable development and prosperity while safeguarding our environment. But we face a changed reality. Rising unilateralism and protectionism weaken multilateral institutions and the rule of law, the very bedrock of the post-war order. À eux seuls.
In 2024 alone, 300 million people needed humanitarian assistance. 120 million were displaced. More than 40 million were refugees. Conflicts cost $14 trillion a year for the global economy. And each of these figures is not simply a statistic, but it's a child, a family, a community. Each and every one of them are just proof of why we must respect together the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, the Refugee Conventions, and Human Rights Conventions.
These stark realities, retreat is not an option. Canada will not turn inward. Canada will work to reform and strengthen multilateral institutions such as the United Nations so that they are more resilient and more effective in meeting the challenges of today and tomorrow. Canada is an Arctic nation. In the Arctic, a critical part of Canada and the world, climate change and new geopolitical pressures create both risks and responsibilities. Canada will safeguard its sovereignty, modernize NORAD with the United States, bolster NATO with fellow members, and work with Indigenous peoples to ensure that the Arctic remains a region of peace, cooperation, and sustainable development. The challenges to security are not confined to our own borders. Russia's 2022 illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine stands as a grave breach of the UN Charter. Russia's aggression, attacks on civilians, and abduction of children are flagrant violations of international law. Putin believed Ukraine would fall in 3 days. 3.5 years later, Ukraine still stands, its sovereignty intact, its people unbowed, its courage unbroken. Canada's position is clear. Putin cannot be permitted to redraw boundaries at his will. Might does not make right. Ukraine is not backing down, nor will its friends, including Canada.
In supporting Ukraine, we are not only defending a nation, we are defending the founding principles of sovereignty, dignity, and peace. Values that unite us all. Canada has already pledged $22 billion of various types of aid to Ukraine, and Ukraine can count on our long-term support. Here at the UN, last week, the Prime Minister Carney and President Zelensky reaffirmed our shared commitments, something that is shared by a large number of you here, to bring back Ukrainian children, bring them home.
The October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas on Israeli civilians was absolutely horrific. Hamas is a terrorist organization and an impediment to peace. Canada calls on Hamas to lay down its weapons and to release all remaining hostages immediately. The scope of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is catastrophic and requires urgent action. Canada has committed over $340 million in humanitarian aid, and our call on Israel to help protect the civilian population. Humanitarian aid at scale, and to ensure the two-state solution is eroding, as is evident in Israel's illegal expansion, lacks long-standing Canadian policy based on the right of commitment to a two-state solution, live side by side in peace, continue their efforts to reach a ceasefire processes that must follow. Canada will participate. We are committed to efforts to strengthen the capacity of partners in the region. On Haiti.
In Haiti, violence is destroying lives and undermining stability. Canada supports the efforts made at the UN Security Council to tackle violence, put a stop to gang violence, and re-establish governance and open the way for stable democracy and a greater level of regional security. These struggles are not something that happens far away in today's interconnected world. Conflicts, indeed, that break out anywhere in the world affect all of us.
Global economy, Canada's diplomacy is also focused on delivering growth and economic resilience for our people. To grow our economy and create opportunities for our businesses, Canada is deepening partnerships in Europe, the Indo-Pacific, the Americas, and Africa. Recent progress includes a strategic defense partnership with the European Union, the Canada-Indonesia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, signed just last week, expanded agreements with Mexico, and continued leadership through key trade agreements such as the CPTPP and CETA. These are not just trade agreements. These are bridges of resilience, engines of prosperity, and commitments to the rules-based system that benefits us all. Through multilateralism, we can build an inclusive and sustainable global economy. And when multilateral institutions are under threat, Canada will not turn inward. We will lock arms with our partners to strengthen institutions, building their legitimacy and their efficacy to meet the challenges of today and tomorrow. We are determined to forge new economic partnerships and leverage our competitive advantages in areas of economic strength. Canada will ensure that we utilize our diplomatic efforts abroad to the benefit of domestic interests as well. Alors que nous...
At a time when we're all looking to strengthen resilience, security, and economic growth of our peoples, we cannot renounce or give up on our multilateral institutions and processes. Multilateralism remains our best hope to address global challenges. Rather than rejecting international norms, we should instead strengthen multilateralism by reforming its international institutions. This is the only way that international institutions will be able to address the challenges that we are all facing, while all the while providing results for our nations and peoples.
Have an opportunity to act with pragmatism and flexibility in our efforts to deal with collective challenges. That is good advice for all of us in our chamber here today. We need to bring together the representatives of those countries and entities that are both relevant to and affected by the crises at hand. As we have seen with the Coalition of the Willing for Ukraine, these efforts in support of the UN Charter need to become the new norm so that we can move forward on urgent challenges at scale and at speed. A generation of Canadians, including Canada's fierce and inspiring ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Rae, who has provided a lifetime of dedicated service to our country, helped to build these multilateral institutions. And I pay tribute to Bob for his lifetime of dedicated service to our country. Our goal will always be to prevent and to resolve international conflicts while modernizing global institutions so that they can meet the challenges of the future. To close, Canada is committed to leaving future generations not only a safer, more prosperous, more inclusive, and more peaceful world, but also a more sustainable one. Canada will be defined not by the strength of our values, but by the value of our strength. We know that no country can meet today's challenges alone. As former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan once said, in an era of global challenges, the world needs multilateralism now more than ever. No nation can solve its problems alone. This is the spirit of Canada. and Canadians are rising to the challenge. We will work toward a world where prosperity is shared, security is collective, and peace is lasting. This is Canada's pledge in this era of geopolitical challenge and change. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Miigwech.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Canada. I now give the floor to His Excellency Javier Bosoto, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Honduras.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam President of the General Assembly, Secretary General of the United Nations, Heads of State and of Government, Ambassadors, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I address you today on behalf of the Government of the Republic of Honduras and on behalf of President Iris Xiomara Castro Sarmiento, the first woman to lead the destiny of our nation, who recognizes the historic meaning of this General Assembly, which commemorates 80 years since the establishment of the United Nations. 8 decades have elapsed since humanity, in the wake of the horror of 2 world wars, decided to build a new legal, moral and political framework to preserve peace, protect fundamental rights, and build equal development between peoples. Today, in 2025, we need urgently to see if this foundational promise has been fulfilled, or, worse, if there is the risk of it being meaningless, given the unprecedented challenges of the 21st century. Madam President, the world is not peaceful. The genocide in Gaza, the devastation in Ukraine, persistent violent crises, particularly in the Middle East, Africa and Haiti, the dangerous weapons business of global capitalism, all show the failure of the multilateral system to fulfill its essential mandate to achieve peace, to prevent barbarism, to stop the progression of the nuclear race, which major powers are engaged in and which could be the apocalypse of humanity. We categorically reject the fact that the most important decisions on peace and security throughout the world are hoarded in the hands of 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Their veto power, which has become an anachronistic privilege, has paralyzed collective action and the calls for peace in different parts of the world, and has allowed those committing war crimes to enjoy impunity. The UN cannot remain a hostage to special interests, nor can it be idly complicit in the face of the destruction of entire peoples. It is morally unacceptable that while billions of dollars are spent on weapons, budgets for peacekeeping operations, humanitarian aid and sustainable development are being slashed. How can it be justified that the voice of 193 states who are present in this General Assembly and who are in favor of peace, to put an end to the different power blocks, can be cancelled out by one vote? We cannot continue to sustain a global order founded on privilege and inequality that leads to suffering for millions of poor people throughout the world. If we want the UN to survive as a guarantor of peace and not as an impotent bystander, we urgently need to reform its foundational charter. That is why Honduras joins the clamour of the Global South, demanding that the UN Charter be structurally changed to democratize the Security Council so that it once again has legitimacy, effectiveness, and justice for the nations of the world. To be clear, we are proposing the following. First of all, to broaden the composition of permanent members and non-permanent members, ensuring equitable regional representation therein. Secondly, we need to get rid of the veto, particularly when peace is looked for. And we need to ensure that this is particularly the case where there is genocide, war crimes, and widespread violations of human rights. Thirdly, we need to beef up the role of the General Assembly, providing the Assembly with more power, more binding power, in decisions pertaining to peace, security, and development. And finally, we need to open decision-making fora for women, indigenous peoples, youth, and diasporas, whose voice continues to be marginalized. Honduras is not accepting any more excuses. We will not remain silent in the face of injustice. The norms of the international order cannot continue to be defined by the logic of war, the hegemony of capital, or strategic workings of the most powerful. It must reflect the universal desire of people to live in peace, democracy, with dignity and freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, in Honduras we have embraced these principles. In these 3.5 years of democratic government, led by President Xiomara Castro, nation dignity once again. By restructuring our institutions, recovering and upholding people's civil, political, and environmental rights. 12 years and 7 months on since the coup d'etat against the democratic president Manuel Zelaya in Honduras, back then, a drug dictatorship was installed, whose head, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was convicted in New York and sentenced to 45 years imprisonment for being part of a drug trafficking cartel to traffic drugs towards the United States. Public-private corruption, violence, and institutional deterioration were the instruments used by the Honduran oligarchy to continue exploiting our natural resources and our entire people. Our government has begun the process to recover from this episode by carrying out root and branch changes, focusing on the well-being of the majorities who were sacrificed by the drug dictatorship and historically excluded by the neoliberal economic model. This recovery has meant putting people's lives above business and putting education and health above privilege. Our progress has been clear. Poverty, which was 73% in 2021, has come down to 63% in 2024. And extreme poverty has been reduced from 54% to 40%. This means that more than 1 million people in Honduras have been lifted out of poverty in these 3 years. Inequality has also been reduced by almost 6 points on the Gini index. This is double what the previous government had achieved. In addition to this, the income of the 20% poorest, who had been sacrificed as a result of the looting and the indebtedness that had been carried out by the previous government, in contrast to this, in the administration of the democratic socialism of Xiomara Castro that we now have, These people have seen their income increase by 150%, and they now have access to health, sports, security, education, roads, agriculture, and energy provided free of charge. In terms of security, Honduras ended 2024 with a homicide rate of 26 for each 100,000 inhabitants. This is the lowest rate in 20 years. In the anti-corruption fight, we have opened our public finances to scrutiny from social audits. We have got rid of corrupt trust funds, and we have recovered our public goods. The tax justice law sent to the National Congress is part of our progressive tax reform, which aims to redistribute wealth for education, health, agriculture, and social protection, and it eliminates privileges given to the most powerful 25 economic groups and 10 families who monopolize 80% of the country's GDP and enjoyed generous tax breaks. In terms of gender, we have improved gender equality in decision-making. Our cabinet has equal representation of women and men, and we also have programs that have been rolled out to eradicate gender-based violence. Distinguished delegates, Honduras is striving to recover its forests. We have a zero deforestation program to 2030. In this effort, we have established 3 military battalions to protect our forests. Honduras is one of the countries that it suffers most as a result of climate change, even though we are one of the countries that contributes the least to global pollution. Droughts, devastating storms, a loss of biodiversity, and forced displacements are all open wounds that we have not caused, but which we are nevertheless paying with our lives and with our future. This is a struggle that we cannot carry out alone. Similarly, we reject the way in which migration is being criminalized, with harsher laws and more militarized borders. This road resolves nothing. It only perpetuates tragedy. It multiplies suffering, and it denies the fact that there is shared international responsibility to address a human and global phenomenon. People migrate as a result of unequal systems that have failed them for years, not because of their own choice. Criminalizing them means punishing them twice, first to poverty and then to exile. Colleagues, our foreign policy is based on our unwavering respect for sovereignty, the self-determination of people, and human rights. That is why we denounce the illegal unilateral sanctions that throttle economies and condemn people to misery. These measures, such as those imposed against Cuba for decades now, must cease immediately. We unreservedly condemn all forms of foreign occupation and threats of military interference in our hemisphere. They are totally unacceptable. Measures such as these mean denying people's rights to live in free sovereign states. This right is inalienable, and its recognition cannot continue to be postponed or manipulated. No rhetorical justification can legitimize the violation of sovereignty or the subjugation of nations. That is why today, before this General Assembly, we repeat our recognition of the State of Palestine, in line with our historic commitment and with our unwavering stance in favor of peace, security, and the coexistence of 2 states in the Middle East. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, this November, Honduras will hold general elections, which will be transparent, inclusive, and democratic. the government of President Xiomara Castro will ensure the free participation of all political sectors, respect for public freedoms, and the presence of regional and international electoral observation missions. Madam President, the United Nations must dare to change so as not to be a relic of the past, but rather the voice of the future. 80 years since its establishment, it is not enough to commemorate the past. It is now time to open fora for dialogue and hope for a better tomorrow that is still possible. Thank you very much.
I thank the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Honduras. I now give the floor to His Excellency Edouard Bizimana, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Regional Integration and Development Cooperation of Burundi.
Monsieur le Président,
President, Secretary General, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I am taking the floor today on behalf of the President of the Republic of Burundi, His Excellency Evariste Ndayishimiye, who bestowed upon me the honour of representing him at this assembly and to share the views of Burundi. Today, as we mark the 80th anniversary of our organisation, something that we're saying of better together, 80 years and more for peace, development and human rights. Allow me, first of all, to warmly congratulate Ms. Annalena Baerbock for her outstanding election to preside over the 80th session of the General Assembly. And I assure her that she has the support of Burundi. I'd also like to take this opportunity to pay a well-deserved tribute to your predecessor, my brother Philemon Yang, and pay tribute to his admirable personal and professional qualities, and thank him for the exceptionally professional way in which he presided over the 79th session, which we have just successfully concluded. Finally, I would like to commend the courage of Mr. Antonio Guterres, who, for as long as he's been Secretary General of our organisation, has always advocated for the reform of the UN system to make it more effective and more credible. He also has the support and encouragements of Burundi. 80 years ago, the United Nations was born to a world ravaged by war. Its main mission was to preserve peace and foster cooperation between states and promote human rights. However, given what's happening today in some parts of the world, we should really be asking ourselves if the UN is still on this trajectory. Today, as we're marking this anniversary, I'm honoured to reaffirm Burundi's commitment to these founding ideals. The same ideals that guided the UN have guided the UN's Charter since 1945. That shows the importance of the theme that is bringing us together this year. Far from being simply a slogan, it throws back to a historic need, a moral commitment, and indeed the only path towards a shared future. Indeed, as long as it has existed, the UN has made a great contribution to maintaining peace. It has supported ways of decolonisation. It has promoted international law as well as the universality of human rights. It has fostered cooperation between nations and inspired generations of leaders and people. Burundi, which was once a beneficiary of this international solidarity, today is actively contributing to it, whether this be through peacekeeping troops, diplomatic engagement, or indeed using its voice within multilateral fora. Also, Burundi is a real-life example of resilience and of the return of peace. Our nation has gone through very difficult moments, but through and thanks to the will of its people and its strengthened institutions, Burundi was able to turn the page on conflict and choose instead the path of reconciliation, stability and mutual respect. We created national transitional justice mechanisms with a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is painstakingly and courageously continuing its work so that future generations will be able to build on solid foundations without hatred or a spirit or any search for vengeance. As a part of our candidate to be a Human Rights Council, we will stand against any politicisation of human rights. Thus, we denounce special mechanisms which are sometimes imposed on some countries, including Burundi, for rather subjective reasons. This is why I reiterate Burundi's request to withdraw the initiative to extend for the mandate of the famous human rights special rapporteur on human rights in my country, who for 10 years has been publishing subjective and biased reports on Burundi, as if Burundi and indeed time had stood still over the last 10 years. In Burundi, President, we have undertaken significant efforts to strengthen the rule of law, fight impunity and promote civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights. Notable progress has been recognised by several partners, bilateral and multilateral partners, that is, as is shown by our constructive cooperation with multilateral partners. However, the Special Rapporteur seems to not have noticed this progress. But, as we all know, peace is only sustainable if development is there too. That's why Burundi has resolutely committed to implement the SDGs, paying particular attention to agriculture in order to create real food security. We're also focusing on education for all, health care, energy, the empowerment of women and young people, and environmental protection and other areas. This is the spirit that inspired our vision for Burundi with an emerging economy by 2040 and a developed economy by 2060. This vision is fully in line with the SDGs, and it shows our will to build a future where every citizen can prosper and actively contribute to the sustainable development of their country. President, ladies and gentlemen, as we celebrate 8 decades of our shared organisation, we cannot close our eyes and turn our back on the tension, ongoing or latent conflicts, the horrors that we're seeing in Gaza, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Sudan, in the Sahel, and in many other areas of the planet. The violence that we've been seeing recently, particularly the indifference and the cynicism that seem to be accompanying it, have reached such heights that we can't help but wonder where our humanity, where our empathy, where our sense of duty have gone. What happened to our commitment to cooperate for a better world? We need to have a heart of stone to remain indifferent to the suffering of the people in the DRC and in Gaza. When faced with this situation, Burundi believes that only a renewed and fair multilateralism can provide lasting responses to the many crises that we're facing. Geopolitical manoeuvring calculations based on indifference, inaction, or on double standards or on egotism are dragging us into the abyss. This is why Burundi is appealing for peace. But for real peace. Not a peace that is selective, nor one that is subject to egotistical, self-serving interests. The peace that Burundi wants to see is a peace that's based on international law, on dialogue, and the respect of state sovereignty. President, neither peace nor human rights can prosper without social justice and without equality between nations. This is why Burundi stands side by side with its African partners and advocates for more just representation of Africa within decision-making bodies, particularly the Security Council. This is a condition for its legitimacy and effectiveness. How can an entire continent that has made such a contribution to the life and efforts of the UN be ignored in this way? Africa remains the only continent that for 80 years now has not had a permanent seat at the Security Council. In this connection, Burundi welcomes the ambitious UN 80 initiative, the initiative that seeks to strengthen effectiveness, coherence and relevance of the UN system. We share the conviction that 80 years after its creation, our organisation needs audacious and lucid modernisation. However, we wish to underscore the concerns expressed by numerous countries in the global south, particularly countries in Africa. It is crucial that this reform be member state-led, guided by a spirit of equal geographical representation, transparency, multilingualism, and the respect for regional priorities. Development, social and economic rights, the fight against inequality, climate action, and international solidarity must never be sidelined in the name of streamlining. A more effective UN, yes. A UN that's just reduced to budgets and technocratic work, no. Moreover, no reform of the UN system would overcome the question of political governance. We'd recall that the Security Council reform has been worked on for decades. It now is a question of justice. Africa has a united voice on this issue in the Eswatini consensus, is demanding that the historic injustice be corrected so that Africa can be fairly represented in decision-making bodies. It's not a favour, but it is a right, if we want the UN to remain loyal to itself. In summary, Burundi is supporting ambitious reform, but as long as it is inclusive, just, balanced, and focused on the real needs of people, rather than being a reform that's fashioned by external priorities. President, as we work to reform multilateralism, guided by justice, dialogue, and truth, the recognition of historic injustice should be the bedrock upon which we build lasting peace. This is why Burundi would like to reaffirm the importance of the recognition of the genocide committed against the Hutu of Burundi in 1972. This is a question that's already been brought to the attention of this UN General Assembly during the 79th session. The memory, truth and reconciliation are powerful tools to rebuild society and to build peace. Silence cannot be an option when we're talking about restoring the dignity of victims and preventing from tragedies of the past from happening again. Thus, Burundi would humbly request the support of all UN member states and support for the recognition of this genocide. Before I conclude, President, I wish to reaffirm Burundi's will and its appeal to walk together towards a common future. This 80th session is a lot more than simply an anniversary. It's an appeal. We're at a crossroads, and the 80th session of our General Assembly must be a time for a moral awakening, solidarity, and for us to remember our shared humanity. The UN of tomorrow must be one that represents equity, justice, and action. It must reflect the realities of our world today to ensure that all voices are heard so that we can build lasting peace for present and future generations, as stipulated in the preamble of the UN Charter. Burundi is ready to continue to make its active contribution to establishing and maintaining peace, to consolidating the values of fair and inclusive development, as well as solidarity, mutual respect, and peaceful coexistence. Because yes, it is together and better together we'll be able to preserve peace, guarantee human rights, and ensure a dignified future for our children. It is a question of the credibility and the reputation of our shared organisation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Regional Integration and Development Cooperation of Burundi. I now give the floor to His Excellency Ahmed Attaf, Minister of State, Minister for Foreign Affairs, National Community Abroad, and African Affairs of Algeria.
Bismillah.
In the name of God, most compassionate, most merciful, Your Excellency, Mr. President, our United Nations organization celebrates its 80th year. And Algeria, together with the UN, celebrates the 7th decade of enlisting the issue of Algerian liberation on the program of this assembly. We celebrate these two memories in a global reality that is extremely turbulent and intricate. It is an international reality where conflicts have accumulated while settlements are absent, a reality where technological revolutions have proliferated while the development gap has expanded between the North and the South. A reality where instruments and treaties and commitments are abundant while implementation and commitment to their letter and spirit are scarce. In this complex situation, our organization is incapable and voiceless and marginalized. Its enshrined principles are violated, and its adopted resolutions are not implemented. Multilateralism that has been established by the United Nations is being manipulated by unilateral action and self-serving conflicts. The responsibility is entirely upon us, the member states, to restore respect for international law and to restore effectiveness to multilateralism. And we are similarly responsible for empowering the United Nations to restore its status as the beating heart of the international system based on the rule of law. The memory of establishing our United Nations must lead us to reflect on the most important issue on its agenda, which is the question of Palestine. The age of this question of Palestine is as old as the United Nations organization, and the legal essence of this issue takes root in the principles of the UN Charter. And the history of this issue is preserved in more than 1,000 resolutions who have recorded its essence and its legitimacy for more or through more than 900 resolutions adopted by the General Assembly and close to 100 resolutions adopted by the Security Council. The question of Palestine faces the greatest threat ever today, which is the threat of erasure through annexation and displacement, as well as through suffocating the legitimate institutions that represent the Palestinian question, and that may also eliminate the two-state solution that has been the consensus after the Israeli occupation is now loud and proud in its intention to revive what it calls Greater Israel. This situation makes it incumbent on the international community as a whole to uphold the action so that the seal of our 8th decade be the seal of Palestinian pain, catastrophes, and tragedies. It is the response of Palestinian neighbors, in particular Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan, the horrors promises. It is the responsibility to seek to preserve the two-state solution and to build a Palestinian state that is sovereign and independent on the borders of 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital, as a just and lasting settlement for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We appreciate the increasing recognition of the state of Palestine, and we also reiterate the call launched by our President Abdelmajid Tebboune to empower the requires the need to end decades of marginalization. The marginalization that our continent suffers in the different centers of decision-making in the world, starting with the Security Council and the World Bank and the IMF, as well as the World Trade Organization. In light of this reality, it is highly concerning that peacekeeping missions in Africa be targeted by a package of restrictions that limit missions' ability to carry out their mandates in the name of and prosperity in the region requires the countries of the North Coast and the countries of the South Coast to adopt a comprehensive and inclusive approach that we hope will be the heart of what we call the new era for the Mediterranean.
نهج يعيد للعلاقات
An approach that will restore to Euro-Mediterranean relations the balance in substance and in form, an approach that will make economic development on the southern front a shared priority in a strategic and urgent manner, and that will restore the balance of roles so that the countries of the north be a driver for growth and development within a balanced partnership based on investment and technology transfer and expanding the prospects of shared prosperity. For 2 years, Algeria has been privileged and has enjoyed the confidence of this General Assembly through its election as a non-permanent member in the Security Council. Here we are today, about to end this tenure, and we are hopeful that we have lived up to your confidence and have been loyal to the trust that you have granted us. The President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, desired for Algeria's membership in the UN Security Council to be a membership of loyalty to the principles and purposes of the United Nations Charter, a loyalty to Algerians' Arab and African belonging, and loyalty to Algeria's identity and its history of struggle for freedom. Accordingly, we have pursued with all our effort and sincerity to translate these commitments to actions through coordination with our African brothers and sisters within the A3 group and through cooperation with our partners within the wider group of the elected 10 members, and as well as through relevant leaders of brotherly and sisterly nations and friendly nations outside the Security Council. We have attempted and exerted our utmost, where we have been successful at times and at other times have not achieved our desired goals. However, we have not surrendered and have never taken for granted a status quo.
أن عجز مجلس الأمن عن الاستجابة لكثير من الاستحقاقات المصيرية
Security Council's inability to address a lot of critical issues at the forefront of which is the issue of Gaza
صوت الضمير الدولي الذي تجلى ولا يزال يتجلى
did not silence the international conscience that is loudly heard in the overwhelming majority of the member states in the Security Council and in this UN General Assembly. The international conscience remains alive and alert through this overwhelming majority, and therefore Algeria is certain that hope remains alive for a better future.
غد أفضل لمنظمتنا الأممية.
A better future for our United Nations, a better future for the international community, and a better future for the whole of humanity. Thank you all, and thank you, Madam President.
I thank the Minister of State, Minister of Foreign Affairs, National Community Abroad, and African Affairs of Algeria. I now give the floor to His Excellency Denis Ronaldo Moncada Colindres, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Nicaragua.
Señor Presidente,
President,
estamos nuevamente en este escenario
once again,
que dice representarnos
we address
a los
you from this
pueblos y
rostrum,
gobiernos
which claims to
de todo el
represent the
mundo.
people and government of the entire world.
Aquí traemos, como siempre,
Here, as
el
always,
saludo
we
afectuoso
bring
y luchador
the affectionate
de nuestro
greetings
heroico
of
pueblo
our heroic
nicaragüense,
Nicaraguan
que
people,
como sabemos
who,
y decimos,
as we know and as we
sabe
say,
de batallas,
understand battles,
de honor
honor,
y de la gloria de
and the
defender
glory of
nuestros
defending our
principios y
principles and
valores,
values,
nuestra dignidad
our
soberana,
sovereign dignity,
nuestros derechos
our
y
rights,
particularmente el sagrado
the
derecho
sacred
de
right
ser
to be
libres
free,
y por lo tanto de elegir
and
nuestros
thus
modelos
to
culturales,
choose our own
sociales,
cultural, social,
económicos
economic,
y
and
políticos
political model
para avanzar
to make
contra la
progress
pobreza
in the fight against
frente
poverty,
a todos los desafíos de estos momentos
faced with all the
inclementes
challenges
de la
of these
historia de la
difficult
humanidad.
moments in the history of humanity.
Nos presentamos aquí una
We
vez
stand
más
here once again,
orgullosas y
proud
orgullosos de nuestras hermandades
of
con pueblos
our brothers and
combativos,
sisters,
íntegros,
our links with
decentes,
other
como son
combative,
todos los
decent
pueblos del
peoples,
mundo,
as are all the peoples
pueblos
of the
y
world,
familias
peoples
que
and families
defendemos,
whom we defend,
resguardamos
protect,
y sostenemos
and sustain
nuestras
in all of
prerrogativas
our
y
prerogatives
creencias
and beliefs,
desde culturas
in all the
y
cultures
prácticas
and practices
que los colonialistas
that
e
the
imperialistas del
colonialists
mundo
and
han
imperialists of the
querido
world have
asaltar
tried to attack,
y de las que nos han
and which they
pretendido
have tried to
despojar
steal from
sin que
us,
pudieran
without
y
being
sabemos
successful
que
in that
no
effort,
podrán.
and we know that they will not
En
ever
estas
be successful
circunstancias
in that
cruciales
effort.
de la historia humana
At this
se
critical
repite la
juncture,
disyuntiva,
the
la
dilemma
dualidad
is
eterna,
repeated,
el
the
conflicto
eternal
nunca
duality,
resuelto
the never
entre la
resolved
paz
conflict
y la
between
guerra,
peace and war,
entre la vida
between
y la muerte,
life and death,
entre la pretensión
between the
supremacista de
supremacist
aniquilar,
attempt to
someter
annihilate,
y
subjugate,
apropiarse
and
de nuestras
appropriate our
culturas
cultures,
y nuestro deber
and our
de defender
duty to defend
nuestros
our spiritual,
patrimonios
social,
espirituales,
and material
sociales
heritage.
y materiales. Estos son momentos que nos definen.
These are the times that
O
define us.
estamos por la paz
Either
y
we're
la
in favor
vida
of peace and
o
life,
cobardes promotores
or we are
de la
cowardly
guerra,
promoters of
la
war,
miseria
misery,
y la muerte.
and death.
Para Nicaragua, bendita
Nicaragua,
y siempre digna,
blessed and always
soberana,
dignified,
libre,
sovereign,
no hay disyuntiva.
forever free, there is no
Somos
choice.
vida,
We are life,
salud,
health,
fuerza, fortaleza.
strength, and
Somos luz y
steadfastness.
verdad. Como decía nuestro inmortal general Sandino,
in proud and
y
undefeated
somos
hope,
conciencia
we
y
are
valentía
light and
alzadas,
truth, as our
dispuestos a
immortal
servir
General
a las
Sandino
causas
said,
sublimes y
and we are also
superiores de
inspired
la
conscience
humanidad,
and courage, willing
al
to
bien
to
supremo de
serve
todas y
the
todos,
superior
a la
causes of humanity,
concordia,
the
al
supreme good of all,
entendimiento, a la
concord,
comprensión,
understanding,
a la
sensitivity,
fraternidad,
fraternity,
a la convivencia
coexistence,
y a la
and cooperation
cooperación entre
among
todas
all
y
people,
todos para
in
compartir
order to share
los bienes
the goods
que son
that belong
de
to
todas
everyone.
y todos. El futuro está
The
hecho
future
del
is
vigor y
made
la gloria de
of the
nuestros
glory of our
pueblos,
people,
que sabemos
who
que
know
luchar y vencer
that
son
fighting
sinónimos
and overcoming
y que siendo
are synonyms,
la lucha el más
that
alto
struggle
de
is
los
the highest
cantos,
of all songs,
luchar
and
es
that to
crear
fight
las necesarias
means creating the
victorias
victories
del bien
necessary
común.
for the common good.
La familia humana
The
exige
human family
respeto y
demands
paz.
respect and peace.
La familia
The
humana
human family
exige
demands
encuentro solidario
solidarity,
entre
inspired
seres que
encounters between
somos
beings who are
iguales en
equal
todos
in
los
every
sentidos
way,
y
and who are
complementarios
also complementary
también en todos los
in every
sentidos.
way.
La familia humana
The human
exige
family
respeto
demands respect
a todos los
for
acuerdos
all
que
of
hace
those agreements
80
that were
años se
made 80
tomaron
years ago
al crear las
when the
Naciones
United Nations was
Unidas
established
para detener las
in order to
guerras
stop
y
wars
hacer de
and
la
to
paz
build
firme,
lasting peace
duradera,
and justice,
de la justicia,
the treasure
un tesoro
and
y un
patrimony
patrimonio
of
de todas
all
y
human
todos.
beings.
La familia humana
The human
espera,
family hopes,
confía,
trusts,
propone y al mismo
proposes, and at
tiempo
the same time
reclama,
insists
demanda, requiere
on
unión
and
para
demands
alcanzar la
union to
plenitud
reach
de la
the fullness of
inteligencia,
intelligence,
la serenidad,
serenity,
la sabiduría,
wisdom,
la calma
calm,
y la humildad
and humility,
indispensables para
indispensable
construir,
to build
ya no para
and no
destruir.
longer to destroy.
Nos referimos a todos los temas que
We are
resultan
referring to all the
prioritarios en
issues that are
nuestros tiempos.
priorities in our time.
La justicia
Climate
climática,
justice,
las indemnizaciones o reparaciones
compensation
a
and
quienes han sufrido
reparations to those
y
who have endured
padecido
and
las
suffered
desgracias y
the
los males
misfortunes and
generados
evils
por el egoísmo y
brought
la
about by
avaricia del
selfishness and the greed
colonialismo,
of
el imperialismo,
colonialism,
el racismo y
racism,
todas las formas
all
abominables
of
y
the
oprobiosas de
abominable,
opresión, discriminación,
disgraceful forms of oppression,
esclavitud
discrimination,
y negación
slavery, and
de
denial
nuestra
of our
condición
condition
y calidad
and
de seres
quality
humanos.
as human beings.
Denunciamos y condenamos como pueblos
As
agraviados por la
peoples
discriminación
aggrieved by
xenófoba
xenophobic
y la
discrimination and
barbarie,
barbarism, we
la
denounce
completa de compasión con la que hemos sido
plundering and looting of
tratados
what is ours.
en países cuya riqueza está
We
construida
denounce the
sobre el
brutality and complete
expolio
lack of
y
compassion
el
with which we
saqueo
have been and are
de las
still treated
nuestras.
by countries whose wealth is built on
Denunciamos y
looting our
condenamos
wealth.
junto a todos los pueblos del
Together with all
mundo
peoples of the
las
world,
horrorosas, odiosas
we
y execrables
condemn
políticas de
categorically
criminal
the
bloqueo
hateful,
económico,
execrable
agresiones con
policies
medidas
of
coercitivas,
criminal economic
arbitrarias,
blockade,
unilaterales
aggression through
y las
coercive,
terribles
arbitrary,
políticas
unilateral
migratorias
measures, as well as the
que desconocen el derecho
migration
humano,
policies which ignore
que
human
violan
rights,
los derechos
which
humanos
violate human
y que
rights,
son
and
reflejo
are a
y
reflection
espejo
and a
del
mirror of the
egoísmo y el
selfishness and
desprecio
contempt
de quienes se
of those
creen
who believe that
dueños
they
del
own the
mundo.
world.
Aquí denunciamos y
Here
condenamos
we
nuevamente
categorically condemn
todos
once
los
again
atropellos
all of the
salvajes,
savage,
atroces,
atrocious,
incomprensibles a estas
incomprehensible
alturas de la vida
outrages at this stage of life
que las
that the
potencias
imperialist
imperialistas
powers
despliegan
deploy
con sus políticas
through their
económicas,
economic, cultural,
culturales
and
y
trade
comerciales,
policies,
pretendiendo continuar
seeking to
dominándonos
continue
e
dominating us
intentando burdamente
and grossly trying to
intimidarnos
intimidate
con
us
sus estúpidos armamentos
with
y
their foolish
aparatosos
armaments
aparatajes
and
militares
ostentatious military
dirigidos
designs
contra la
directed
paz
against peace
en Asia,
in Asia,
África
Africa,
y nuestra
and our
América
Latin American
Latina
Caribbean.
caribeña.